Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are Mythvision.
Dr. Price, Zane Barnett writes, what's the deal with the Q source? How can it be a source if it doesn't even exist? Is it just a consensus guess? By the way, I'm new to higher criticism. I started last fall. I have been going through your podcast, Dr. Bob. I've listened to 2019 to 2020, and now going through them all starting with 2014 and 15. I've learned a lot, and you have touched on this question before, but not in detail. Thank you for answering this question and all the excellent work you do. Shalom.
So what is it, or why do I accept it?
So he says, what's the deal with the Q source? How can it be a source if it doesn't exist, right? We don't have it. Is it just a consensus guess? So he's trying to figure out, like a lot of people do, why, I guess, what is the Q source? Do you really believe there was a manuscript prior that may have been like, this was like a mark, but let's just say it was Bob. All right, this is written by Bob, or we call it the Gospel of Bob. And that's the Gospel Q, where you're going to find these sayings that aren't in Mark, that are in Luke and Matthew and stuff, possibly even in John, I don't know, but was there a text that was primitive, or is this just a consensus thought of things that they call Q?
Well, it is a consensus educated guess because we don't have it. But this wouldn't be the only source we're pretty sure existed, though we don't have it, because J, E, D, and P in the Old Testament is really hard to argue against that. Though we don't have copies anymore. They apparently stopped making copies once they had this fused together. In fact, we're lucky we have the four Gospels, because Tatian, or somebody in the 2nd century, wove those together as the Diatessaron, which is exactly the same idea as J, E, D, and P. So that's not surprising. Now, how would Q have gotten lost if it was this valuable early gospel? And Mark did not. We still have Mark. Well, that's not too tough to explain either, given that in all probability, Mark, and I mean, assuming there was a Q for the moment, Matthew and Mark agree on so much, because Q is the hypothetical source for all of the stuff that Matthew and Luke have that they didn't get from Mark because it isn't in Mark. So if you had virtually all of Q preserved between the longer Gospels, Matthew and Luke, you might well figure, what's the point of continuing to copy Q where you pretty much got it here? But with Mark, which you could have said the same thing about, it seemed to be the official Gospel of Rome, and that was so heavyweight in the early church that they couldn't just stop copying that. They'd be held to pay if they did. So Mark was still copied and possibly added to, but even though most of it was reproduced in Matthew and Luke, Matthew has over 90% of Mark included in it. Luke has over 60%, and they both have loads more stuff that only each one of them has, which for convenience sake they call it M for Matthean special material and L for Lucan material. Well, the reason I think that there was a Q is that when you compare Matthew and Luke, the wording in the common material is so close that it can't be coincidence. I mean, that's why people began to talk about gospel sources at all. Others had explored the idea of a common oral tradition, which they still talk about, but before these gospels were compiled from the oral tradition. But at first they thought, no, these are just streams of oral tradition. In fact, some scholars are getting back to that. in light of the theories of Albert Lord and Milman Parry, who were trying to settle the question of whether the Iliad and the Odyssey could have been composed by a single author, either one of them or both, and because it is so long and detailed. And so these guys went to the Balkans, the old Yugoslavia, and they went to coffee houses and celebrations where they had oral bards who would sing or recite traditional epics of their own region, and they would say it supposedly the same way every time, and they figured, well, maybe the Gospels were like that. There were different versions of the Jesus epic that different evangelists recited, and that somebody wrote two of them down, and that's what we've gotten, why they're so similar. But I don't buy that, because they're too similar. You wouldn't have wording the same way, and in fact, further research has shown that these Balkan bards weren't that accurate. They changed them every time, because one of the big conclusions of this research was that there's no original text, that each one keeps evolving and each one is an original. And it's a much less faithful transmission than they originally thought, but apologists eager for anything to throw into the mix still stick by that and say, oh yeah, faithful oral tradition. But it's ridiculous, and it just seems to me that Matthew and Luke either used each other, I mean, depending on which way Matthew used Luke or Luke used Matthew plus Mark. Either that or Matthew and Luke used Mark and something else. And the wording is too close, and when it varies, by a little bit here and there, that can usually be readily explained in terms of editorial tendency. Like Conselman shows in his great book, The Theology of St. Luke, that the many subtle changes that most readers never even notice indicate that Luke really did a rehash of his sources, trying to tamp down apocalyptic enthusiasm. For instance, in the Markan statement, there's some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God coming with power. Luke chops off with power, because that phrase occurs twice elsewhere in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 1, he was declared the Son of God in power or with power through resurrection of the dead. And then in 1 Corinthians, there's something about the same thing. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. And so he didn't want, so that implied the resurrection of the dead. People, some standing here will see all of that, and they didn't. So Luke opens the door to some kind of spiritual or figurative reinterpretation of it. There are three questions that come up only in Luke or Acts that are about the same thing. When, let's see, the parable of the king the guy that goes away a long distance to receive a kingship from the emperor. This is really about Herod Antipas, actually. This happened. And the people sent a delegation saying, no, not this guy, we don't want him. But he gets the crown and comes back and says, where are those people that complained against me? Bring them in here and kill them in front of me. And he says, that's the way it's going to be. But the key thing is, he went a far distance away and came back a long time later. That's a big wink to the reader. Christ has gone away to be enthroned in heaven, but that's far away, and he's coming back, but it'll be a long time. Also, in fact, Luke says he told this parable because some in Jesus' entourage were saying, oh boy, it's going to happen any time now. And he's trying to throw cold water on that. And then there's the thing, the Pharisees ask him, when's the kingdom of God coming? What'll be the sign? Oh, the kingdom of God's not coming with signs to be observed, nor will they say, here it is, there it is, for the kingdom of God is within you. In other words, apocalyptic expectation, forget it. That's not the mode in which it will appear. And then in Acts 1, the disciples who are at the end of a 40-day period of intensive instruction about the kingdom of God. Lord, I said at this time you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel. And he says, look, forget it. The times and dates that the Father has set, they're none of your business. You just get busy preaching the gospel. That's another one. These are only in Luke, and you begin to get the picture, nor is that all of it, where it's unique to him, and when he does overlap with an earlier gospel, he's changed it in that direction. It just seems to me clear that somebody is working from written sources. And Matthew does the same thing to a different end. You can tell that he's added "my Father in heaven" all over the place. And he's much more interested in the niceties of legal observance, what's a legitimate oath and what isn't, and so forth. And so it seems to me that Q and Mark both have undergone tendentious revisions, characteristic of Matthew and unique to Matthew, characteristic to Luke and uniquely in Luke. Now, you could say that, as I mentioned a moment ago, that you could explain the same stuff if you said there was no Q source. And by the way, of course, they call it Q for the German Quelle, Quelle, source. I forget who first dubbed it that, but the Q source is the saying source. And you could say that there's no Q, but that Matthew enlarged and edited Mark, and that then Luke had access to both Matthew and Mark, and that would explain why he agrees with Mark sometimes, and yet disagrees about the so-called Q material, because he's choosing between Mark and Matthew. That's why there's similarities sometimes. Or you could argue that Luke used Mark and Matthew used both Mark and Luke and did the same thing. I still don't find that convincing. It seems to me to be simpler to say that each of these longer gospel writers are tinkering with the Q source, a Q source, in the same way they're tinkering with Mark. And I guess you could say, well, Luke's tinkering with Matthew the same way, and so on. But to me, it seems simpler. And I don't know if it ultimately makes much difference, but it seems to me that the... plus, oh yeah, there's other reasons too. Mark doesn't have a birth narrative. Both of the others do, and they're totally different. Mark doesn't have resurrection appearances. Both of the others do, and they're totally different. And this certainly implies that they had nothing to go on and went further afield. Like for Matthew's nativity story, he's borrowed it from Josephus's Nativity of Moses, and Luke has borrowed the Moses nativity from the biblical antiquities of Pseudo-Philo, including Moses having a sister and the Annunciation was parents and so on. Why would Matthew? If Matthew was original, why would Mark cut that out? Mark doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount, for Pete's sake. Both Matthew and Luke do, though in different versions. Why would he cut that stuff out? And there's other stuff like that.
Or why would they add that? So
yeah, that's easy to explain. Mark doesn't have enough teaching in it. Let's
right. I'm just saying it would be easy if there was another source that had these.
Yeah,
You know, so
and that's one of the big things in Q. That it must have looked a lot more like Luke's version, because in Matthew, a lot of material is added that appears elsewhere in Mark and Luke, individual sayings. It's interesting that both Matthew and Luke have a new Torah. In Matthew, it's the 5 great sections of teaching, each rounded off by a statement. He finished these teachings and went on from there, something very much like it. So there are the 5 books, and he's so determined to have 5 that he combines what should have been 5 and 6, the denunciations of the Pharisees plus the Apocalypse. Why does he cram that in? Because he wants to have 5. Luke doesn't do that, but what he does is to pick material from Mark and Q and create a whole lot more in order to create a new Deuteronomy. Because if you do a side-by-side comparison, it is absolutely striking how there's a few things in Deuteronomy he just skips, but he has other versions, sometimes critiques of Deuteronomy, but it's a pattern that goes on for chapter after chapter. And so he just had a different idea of what Jesus' new covenant Torah was. So I think Q makes the most sense, though much of that could also be explained on these other hypotheses.
join our Patreon